Okay, next comment. And don't worry, it's shorter. So tell me, what did or does inject new material into the genome of a species? If there is a random mutation in one organism's DNA, how does that add to the organism's DNA? Now, this is a very real question, so I think it'd be a bit more fitting for somebody who knows a little bit more about molecular biology than I do. So take it away, Professor Stick.
Hey, what's up guys? Thank you Heath for allowing me to make an appearance. So what do we have here? Yet another creationist who doesn't understand how information can be added to the genome. Pretty typical. Now I could sit here and explain to you the general science behind these mechanisms, but instead I'll just give you a few examples. Number 1, viruses. Yep, this is a very simple one. Viruses inject novel DNA into a host. And no, just because some cells are infected with a virus doesn't mean it always dies. Take a look at our own genome for example. Humans have so many genes that were given to us by viruses. Pretty surprising, huh? Oh wait, but you're talking about mutations or errors within the DNA, right? In that case, let's move on to number 2, replication slippage. This one is a particularly interesting one. On some occasions during DNA replication, DNA polymerase can detach in the middle of the process and reattach in another area to continue replication. If this new area backpedals into a segment already replicated previously, then we have essentially copied a segment of DNA. Now, this can result in the loss or gain of nucleotides depending on the new attachment area. The occurrence of replication slippage may depend on a few factors, but that's a topic for another video. Number 3, unequal crossing over. Yeah, you know that crossing over event during meiosis that you learned about in high school? It's basically that, except the crossing over locations change due to similarity at the different sites of crossing. It results in a duplication at one sequence site and a deletion at the other. This mechanism allows huge additions of genetic information, which can mutate and then be easily passed down to the offspring. Number 4, retrotransposition. This is my favorite one. Basically, we have a few genes in our genome that can be cut and pasted, called transposons, and copy and pasted, called retrotransposons. The gene of a retrotransposon transcribes an RNA, which is then reverse transcribed back into a random part of the genome. This essentially just copies this gene around, and when this gene mutates, it can generate novel proteins. An unmutated pasted gene would be identical to the original, which can also contribute to unequal crossing over. So anyway, those are just 4 out of many different mechanisms that can add genetic information. And that's my time. Back to you, Heath.
Almost all observed mutations of DNA result in a lowered rate of survival for the individual. You're right, almost all. And yes, it does lower the survival rate. That's natural selection. They don't survive as well, while beneficial mutations do survive even better and are better able to replicate, to pass on their genetic information. I'm not talking about microevolution, or rather adaptation, neither of which add genetic material. Okay, here's the thing. You're not thinking about this in scientific terms. You're, quite frankly, thinking of this in the pseudoscientific terms that you were taught by other creationists. Whenever any organism is born with a genetic mutation, that is evolution, no matter what it is, because evolution is simply a change in organism through successive generations. Over time, these such mutations, however small, can add up to make big changes. In a short amount of time, it doesn't affect the organisms as much, typically. That's called microevolution, in a small scale. When you see this over a long period of time, like millions or billions of years, that's macroevolution on a large scale. And adaptation is a different concept altogether. That's when organisms with genetic mutations that are better fit to their environment, especially with new environmental pressures, thrive. But any of these could potentially be any sort of mutation. It could be a deletion mutation, it could be an insertion, a duplication, a substitution, what have you. There are numerous possible mutations. Some of them do add genetic material. But here's the thing. The mutations that add genetic material, namely insertion mutations and gene duplications, typically don't do anything at all. But these organisms can still pass on their DNA just as easily as they did before. And when more organisms have longer strands of DNA, more genetic material to work with, they have more genetic material to be able to change over time and take on different roles. So basically, whenever an organism is born with more genetic material, it doesn't typically affect the organism outright, but it does effectively enable that organism to change more in the future. So it does play a large role in evolution. I'm talking about, how does an individual kind of organism that has no legs acquire the DNA material and instruction to grow legs of the correct size, number, strength, design, and placement in order that those legs are a survival advantage long enough to become the standard for that species through reproduction. Again, this shows that you don't understand evolution. These things happen by small changes. Going back with the primitive fish example, the fish use their limbs to walk around underwater. A small, slight mutation can be beneficial, namely stronger fins. Now, that doesn't jump from one kind of an animal to a whole different kind of animal. They're the same kind, they're the same species, but one's a little bit better than the others. And over time, that adds up if you can keep mutating and keep having similar mutations. Things didn't just immediately appear the way they were, and that just magically fits their environment. Evolution typically works by small, slight mutations, but lots of them after each other over a long period of time, because it adds up. The limbs that animals have today, they have them because they went through this long process, and every step along the way, it was a little bit better than what it was before. Even if an individual has a beneficial mutation to a gene, most of those mutations are not expressed in the offspring of that individual unless it mates with another individual with the same mutation, assuming of course that the mutation doesn't interfere with reproduction. Where is that slightly new and improved organism going to find a mate with which to pass on this mutation? Well, what's your citation for this? Because I highly doubt it. Not every trait is a recessive trait. In fact, it seems that all gain-of-function mutations, which do happen, are dominant. But even if what you're saying is true, it's not actually impossible. If you're saying that a mutation doesn't affect an organism until it mates with another organism with the same mutation, that doesn't actually hurt anything. Because that means that this organism that had an unexpressed genetic mutation functions the exact same as every other organism of its species. That means that it could still very well reproduce with the rest of the species. And if it reproduces with many organisms that don't have this mutation, then it could pass along the mutation to many, many, many children before they find a mate that can express this gene. If one kind of organism has a random mutation, a living organism has to have certain systems/parts all working in concert in order to live. What part evolved first? Was it the respiratory system, the digestive system, or maybe the reproduction system? The answer to this question is actually really tricky, and that's because it all depends on how you define these things, because these things had predecessors that were similar but perhaps not quite what you would call a digestive system or respiratory system or reproductive system. But the answer is probably reproduction, or at least sexual reproduction, because that's what I assume that you mean. See, the simplest organisms reproduced by binary fission. They sort of split apart. But some bacteria, although still reproducing asexually, can exchange genetic information between other bacteria. Now, this process may very well be a precursor to the sexual reproduction that we know and love today. But the answer is even more clear when you look at sponges, because sponges do reproduce asexually by budding and fragmenting, if those are the terms. But they can also reproduce sexually by releasing sperm into the water and holding eggs within themselves. Which, by the way, sponges are hermaphrodites, which kind of explains a lot about SpongeBob. But my point is, this organism doesn't necessarily have a digestive tract that we would call a digestive tract, and it doesn't have a respiratory system that we would call a respiratory system. But it does reproduce sexually. So if sponges are remnants of early evolution, then it's safe to conclude that sexual reproduction did evolve first. But it didn't evolve out of the blue. It evolved alongside animals that still reproduced asexually. We didn't rely on it until after it became better than asexual reproduction. And that's how a lot of this goes. You see, nowadays, we rely on sexual reproduction, but that wasn't always the case. There was a point in time where we didn't rely on it, but sexual reproduction became better than asexual reproduction for whatever reason that was. So we reproduced sexually more than we did asexually. So then organisms that were for some reason unable to reproduce asexually weren't naturally selected out. And the same thing goes with just about everything else, like complex structures, maybe the circulatory system. Lots of primitive animals don't have circulatory systems, but they have precursors to circulatory systems. So over time, the circulatory system became better and better and better to the point where other systems relied on it. Just because our systems rely on each other today doesn't mean that they always did in the past, and it certainly doesn't mean that it didn't come from simpler versions of themselves. Well, that doesn't make much sense. All the systems of life would have to literally pop into existence all at once in order for an organism to live. Even then, where would this lonely little organism find a mate with which to share genetic material? Are you really trying to claim that something so rare and random happened to make two simple tiny little life forms at the same time so much alike that they were able to find each other and procreate? No, you're saying that that's what I'm saying. You're putting words in my mouth. You're saying that I hold ideas that I don't really hold. Evolution doesn't work that way. I'm not saying that. If what you say is true, and we all came from some primordial soup, then why are all life forms degrading instead of improving? Why aren't there many more species and types of life than there are now? I suspect that the issue with all organisms degrading is your perspective on the matter. You see, evolution happens by slight modifications. So, if an organism's muscles are slightly stronger than they were before, you're not really going to notice it. And again, like I've said before, organisms today, especially complex organisms like ourselves, they're already pretty fit to survive in its environment. They've already been pretty molded by its environment to where they are today. So out of all of the possible changes to the phenotype, there are very few that are actually beneficial and much more that are harmful, because it's easier to redo the work that's already been done than it is to improve upon it. And harmful mutations can very well be extremely obvious, like Down syndrome. But as far as why there aren't more species on Earth, there are lots and lots more species that were on Earth that have since gone extinct. And a lot of it has to do with natural selection. If an organism is more likely to branch off into different species relatively quickly, that may very well not be beneficial at all, because it'll be easy to dip below the minimum viable population. So it would be beneficial for organisms to change slowly as opposed to quickly. You really need to answer these questions for yourself. Well, I kind of think I did, and I hope I answered it well enough for everybody else watching as well. You chide one of the creationists for probably not ever reading a science textbook, yet you deny that you are going on faith that what is contained in those textbooks is true. Well, here's the thing. I'm not going by faith. I know you'd like me to, because that essentially brings me down to the level of creationists, but I don't. The conclusions that I come to are because science has come to those conclusions. And science comes to those conclusions because that's the world around us. That's what the evidence that we can see points to. That is the best explanation for the things that we can see. So believing in science, specifically evolution, is not based on faith. It's based on evidence. Maybe you don't see the evidence in the way I do. That doesn't mean I'm wrong, necessarily. If you want to argue whether or not there is a God, much in the same way that if I want to argue whether or not evolution happened, then we need to look at the evidence and evaluate the evidence, instead of saying, you only use faith, when I really don't. Look, for at least a decade and a half, Scientists have been looking and evaluating evidence and seeing that evolution by natural selection is the best explanation for what we can see. We've found proof, evidence, and indication that evolution did happen, and evolution gives a very good explanation for lots of things. I don't believe it just because my science textbooks say so. I believe it because it's very reasonable. And I learned about the proofs of evolution that we have, and it's very convincing. But when creationists make a straw man out of evolution, separate micro and macro evolution, introduce kinds of animals without defining it, and using other very vague, undefined terms, the conversation is lost. It's not really a debate anymore. It's just creationists trying to do everything they can to make evolution look bad. If evolution was disproven, which it would take a lot to do, but if it was disproven, I wouldn't believe in it anymore. So, I don't go by faith. And you don't get to tell me when I do.